Welcome everybody, long-term members, new members, and also especially members of the East Side student body. I'm very pleased that we have a wonderful speaker today. His name is Ray Arsenault. He's a wonderful chap. He's a historian of Southern history. Did I get that right? Not the history of South America, but Southern history. And he's written a lot of books about John Lewis and the Civil Rights Movement, and we're very, very pleased to have him here talking with us today. Welcome to him.
Hello? Testing?
There you go. I was pressing it too hard.
Okay, thank you. All right. I always feel sort of like a Las Vegas lounge lizard, you know, if you want to sing or something. Well, very nice to be here. I have to eat the microphone. I'm always telling when I guest lecturers to eat the microphone, so let me know if I move it down.
Eat it some more.
More?
Dessert.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm literally going to have to eat it, I think.
Yeah, that's just like that.
Okay?
Yeah.
That's better. All right. Okay. Well, I was saying I'm really happy to be here. Sorry that I guess I had a conversation with Paul Hargrave, and I guess he's ill, and sorry that he couldn't make it. And also my good friend Howard Simon, who was sort of the contact for me. Howard and I have known each other for many, many years, and I was the president of the state ACLU at the time, and we were looking for a new executive director, and so we hired him, I think it was 1998, and he'd been at Michigan for 23 years as their executive director, and he's the senior executive director in the country. He's now retired, of course, and he's here in Gainesville because after he retired in Miami, he and his wife built this beautiful house on Sanibel Island just before the storm hit, and they lost everything. And he decided he was done with coastal living, so he decided, well, why not Gainesville? And so he's a wonderful person if you haven't met him yet. Very, very, very smart and decent guy. So, how many of you have ever known John Lewis, or have met him, or anybody? Or heard him speak in person? A couple people? I'm sometimes amazed when I speak on Lewis how many people have actually come in contact with him. I was very fortunate in August to give a lecture in Chautauqua. I always wanted to go to Chautauqua. I highly recommend it. It's like a fantasy experience in Western New York. I've been there since 1874. They have 9 weeks of programs in the summer. They get about 200,000 people who come. And it's like an 1880s village, all wooden and painted white and porches, and it's just an extraordinary experience. So I agreed to speak, and they put me at the Hall of Philosophy. I don't think I've ever spoken in the Hall of Philosophy. It sounds pretty grand, right? And it's outdoors, and it's kind of like a Roman style thing. And they have lots of greenery around where people can bring chairs up. Well, 800 people showed up when I talked. And a number of them had met Lewis, and I must have signed books for hours afterwards. But it was really a moving experience. I've been speaking all over the country since the book came out in last January. And I've really kind of discovered how important John Lewis was to a lot of people. People come up to me with tears in their eyes after the talk, and they always ask me, will there ever be another John Lewis? Who's a candidate to be the new John Lewis? who's going to save us now? You know, from the trumpet's nightmare. And so I've been sort of on the road all over the country for the last 12 months, off and on. And I never get tired of it because I knew John very well. He was a close friend for 20 years, and I decided that this was probably going to be my last book.
Too soon now.
I'm back at school. That's great.
Tom show.
As I was saying, I knew John for 20 years. I've done 12 books, and I'm pretty sure this is my last one. And it was really a labor of love for me because I respected him so much. And I met him in 2000 when I was writing a history of the Freedom Riders. And he was one of the original 13 Freedom Riders in 1961. You know, those kids who got on the buses, black and white, and dared the Ku Klux Klan to stop them. Yeah. And it's a miracle they weren't killed. You know, the bus was firebombed in Anderson, Alabama. Bull Connor let the Klan have at them for 20 minutes in Birmingham. But they knew what they were getting into. I mean, many of them made out their last will and testament before they got on those buses. And they got on those buses in defiance of their parents, their teachers, and their ministers, and because they really believed in nonviolence, as a philosophy, not just as a tactic, but as a way of life. And probably no one more than John believes that. You know, he believed in something called the beloved community. That's a concept that this philosopher Josiah Royce came up with during the First World War, and was an animating philosophy for Gandhi, for Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was a leading pacifist organization in the world, for many, many social justice activists. And it's a rather simple idea about mutual respect, inclusivity, a world where there's no division, where there's no denigration, no exclusion. It's a kind of a utopian ideal. But John Lewis was totally committed to it and devoted his entire life to it, which is a bit surprising considering where he started. You know, he was born in utter poverty in Pike counties in South Alabama. Growing up, he was born in 1940. Of course, he died at age 80 in July of 2020. No running water, no electricity, no indoor plumbing, no paved roads. About 10 miles outside of Troy. He was later known as the boy from Troy. Martin Luther King came up with that. But he really wasn't from Troy. He was from this little tiny Carter's Quarters, it was called. He was one of 10 children. They were sharecroppers. He was the only one who finished high school. No one in his family had ever finished high school. He went off to college and got 2 degrees. It's kind of fitting for me to talk about him to a free speech group because he was, in an early age, was very intellectually curious. I think in part because he hated farm work. His family was like, he'd do anything to get out of chopping cotton. And voracious reader. I discovered that in the times we spent together, how well read he was, and what a deep thinker he was, which sort of belied his appearance. You know, he was very country, and he had a slight speech impediment and a very deep South Alabama accent, and he was aware of that. And but he was curious about the world, really. In fact, his first protest, formal protest, was when he was 16 years old. It was 1956, during the Montgomery bus boycott, when Martin Luther King was emerging as sort of the American Gandhi, leading the boycott, you know. That's just a few miles, actually, from where his family lived. And as I said, he's a voracious reader, and he went to the Jim Crow Library, the Troy City Library, public library, asked them for a library card, right? No problem. Well, they threw him out on the street. And, you know, boy, what do you think you're doing here? You must be a troublemaker. So, even though he was just 16, he wrote up a petition and tried to get his classmates at the all-black school where he was going to sign it, and only a couple of his cousins would sign it. The others were scared. And probably rightly so. There was a lot to be scared of in Troy, Alabama, you know, in 1956. The Klan was very active, incredible amount of intimidation. So he had to give up his initial protest. But many years later, 1998, he wrote a memoir called Walking with the Wind. It's probably my favorite book to come out of the Civil Rights Movement. It's an extraordinary book. I'll recommend it to you. It was #1 on the bestseller list for weeks. Just quite incredible. So the Troy Library invited him as an honored author, speaker. Same library that wouldn't give him a library card, right? So he agrees to come, but before he says anything, he gets up to speak. Before he says anything else, he says, "I want my library card." He had a great sense of humor, and I always love that. I love that story. It's just it's sort of classic John Lewis. He once said, "I'm not a showboat, I'm a tugboat." And what he meant by that, he was like one of the foot soldiers of the movement. His best friend in the movement for a while was Julian Bond, who you may remember is very handsome and like a black prince, you know. He grew up in sort of black royalty. His father was a college president, and they became best friends. And then they ran against each other for Congress in 1986. And everybody thought Julian was going to win. But John just worked harder, and in a big upset, he won a seat in Congress, and he, of course, was never defeated. He served the rest of his life, 17 terms, representing Atlanta in Congress. With respect to free speech, I know that's why you're all here. You may be familiar with this concept of good trouble. All of you, or most of you, have heard of that. So it's become kind of the byword for John Lewis. There are now T-shirts, and you can get anything, good trouble, imprinted on it. All my friends give me all this good trouble stuff, so I walk around with these good trouble shirts on. Well, that concept emerged with John in about 2012, pretty late actually. He always, before that, he would like to say to young students and to people, try to advise them what to do with their lives, say, you've got to get in the way. You've got to get in the way. You've got to stand up for justice. You've got to take risks. But he had a young staff member named Andrew Ashe, who had a big influence on John. First of all, he convinced him to do a graphic novel. And I don't think John knew what a graphic novel was when they started this. And in 2011, he ended up doing 3, actually 4 in total. One was published after his death, called March. You may have seen them in bookstores. It's kind of his story of his life done as a graphic novel. Won the National Book Award. It's quite an incredible piece of work. And Andrew Ashe even got him to go to these sort of counterculture fairs that they have in San Diego and Comic-Con, you know, in Atlanta. And the rest of the staff kind of mocked them. what is John Lewis doing at Comic-Con, right? But he really reached out into kind of the sort of social media world. And Andrew Aiden, his aide, started using good trouble as his hashtag, as his, and eventually convinced John to use that. And he started saying in his speeches, particularly in addresses that he would give to commencement audiences, one at Emory, for example, where he said, you gotta find a way to get into good trouble. Necessary trouble, he'd usually follow with. Necessary trouble. You've got to stand up for what you believe in. You got to make your life mean something. And for the last 8 years, I guess, of his life, he never missed an opportunity to talk about good trouble. And I personally have found it a kind of a wonderful concept, a notion, a shorthand, really. When students or people ask me for advice or what they should do in terms of social justice and free speech, we all should take some of our time to get into good trouble. Of course, in John's case, it was often real trouble. He was beaten 45 times. 45 times. In the later years, you could see he lost his hair, and you could see every mark on the top of his bald head, every billy club, every cattle prod. It's a miracle he survived. He was also arrested 45 times and incarcerated. And it was tough early on with his family. None of the other brothers and sisters really were drawn to the civil rights movement. His parents didn't quite understand why he was so insistent on standing up for his beliefs of social change and racial equality and social justice. And they would say, don't get in trouble. Get out of the way. And there was some alienation for a while. Ultimately, he was reconciled to his family, and now they're incredibly proud of him. And there's an institute in Troy and markers and statues and all that. But they knew that he was putting them in jeopardy. I mean, it was entirely possible that they could lose their farm, lose their lives, it was something he felt he had to do. He didn't want to put them to endanger them, but this search for the beloved community was something that he simply couldn't move away from. I don't think there was any other leader, maybe Dr. King, maybe James Lawson, who was his teacher in nonviolence, who ran nonviolent workshops in Nashville when he was a college student, and who just died actually last year at the age of 95, who is still a very committed nonviolent activist. Jim Lawson spent 3 years in India studying Gandhianism, spent a year in prison as a conscientious objector during the Korean War, and he came in 1958 to Nashville when John Lewis was a sophomore, and started giving these nonviolent workshops, and really transformed the student community in Nashville, so that when the original Freedom Ride, John was one of the original 13, but he was the only one from Nashville, and of course they were stopped. The bus was bombed in Anniston. They couldn't get any more bus drivers to take them on to New Orleans. The idea was a 2-week trip from Washington to New Orleans. They had 13 riders, 7 blacks, 6 whites. They never made it past Birmingham, so they had to give up and fly. And there were other activists in Nashville who said, we can't let it end that way. We're trying to prove that the South, the white South, is ready for nonviolent direct action. We've got to get rid of this Jim Crow system once and for all. So some of John's friends, Diane Nash, who's perhaps chief among them, some people who later become major figures in the movement, C.T. Vivian, many others, they decide to fill in, send Nashville riders to replace the Congress of Racial Equality riders who had been beaten and nearly killed in Birmingham and had to give up their trip. And of course, what Diane Nash said to Bobby Kennedy's aide in the Justice Department over the phone was, we can't let violence push nonviolence out. You know, we have to stay the course, and if they kill us, which they may do, then others will follow. So the idea was, they knew they were being unreasonable in the context of the day. That they weren't fighting for freedom later, they were fighting for freedom now. And they were willing to die for it. I think they have said already, many of them made out their last will and testament before they got on the bus, because they were pretty sure they weren't coming back. You know, and ultimately there were 436 Freedom Riders, 60 different rides. And in 6 months, they really transformed the landscape in the South. They won against all odds. They forced the Kennedy administration to go to the Interstate Commerce Commission and put directives to take all those signs down that have been there for generations, whites only, colored only, and it was just the buses, but it was never just about the buses, of course. It was like a handhold on the cliff in this fight against Jim Crow. And it would take years, but the people who became Freedom Riders, like John, became sort of the shock troops of the movement over the next decade. They transformed citizen politics in the United States. If you look back to the 1950s, the so-called silent generation, you know, there was people didn't think that ordinary people could change the world, but these kids did. They were ordinary people who did extraordinary things, and against incredible odds. And they were able to start with the buses, and then from there they proceeded through the 1960s. John became the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was the youngest speaker for the Big Six at the March on Washington in 1963. He was the only one who was still alive when he died in 2020. You know, he was only 23 years old. You know, just half the age of most of the others who were there. And I'm sure he was very nervous getting up to speak to 250,000 people when you're 23 years old. And he gave a very radical speech, talking about the movement cutting a swath through the South like Sherman's army. Some of the people didn't like that analogy. Brought back some bad memories. You know? But of course, it was all in the context of nonviolence. He was totally committed. He told me once, the one time he thought maybe he was weakening, they were in Selma, Alabama, at the beginning of the voting rights struggle in 1965, in January, and Dr. King had come to give a talk on Emancipation Day in Selma, and they were checking him into a hotel which had never had a black client before. No black had ever stayed in this hotel. But they'd gotten him to agree to take Dr. King. He's standing there near the registration desk, and this notoriously violent Klansman comes up and starts just pounding King away, punching him first in the stomach and then in the head, and really trying to do damage. John was standing right next to Dr. King, and John was short, but built sort of like a fire plug, you know, strong. And so he just wrapped his arms around that Klansman and held him and wouldn't let go until the police came and took him away and arrested him. But in his memoir, he talks about how that was the only time in his life that he ever was tempted to use force or coercion. I mean, he did it for the best reasons, but that's how pure he was in his belief in nonviolence. You know? But he was all about free speech, of course, about speaking your mind. He often said, I'm not really a man of words, even though he was an eloquent writer and developed into, I think, a great speaker, but he was about turning ideas into action. That's what of not giving up, of keeping up the pressure until the United States lived up to its professed democratic ideals. And the moment I remember best about this, I often tell this story. I tell it in the book, but so the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides, we were all on the Oprah show. It was quite a thrill. After my book came out in 2006 on the Freedom Rides, American Experience, Stanley Nelson, who's a great filmmaker, kind of the Black Ken Burns, he did a film. I worked with him for 3 years on this film, and it came out, and it just caused quite an uproar. It's now been seen by more than 60 million people around the world. But they sent Oprah a DVD in the spring of 2011. And within 15 minutes, she calls Stanley Nelson, the director, on the phone, and she's sobbing into the phone. She's saying, I just saw the film. I was so moved. I feel ashamed because I didn't know this story. And I should have known it. I mean, she grew up in Mississippi. Her grandfather lives in Nashville. He's a barber. Many of his clients were former Freedom Riders. She had met Freedom Riders before, but she just didn't know the whole contours of the incredible story of the Freedom Rides. And she said she was winding down her show at that point. She only had 4 shows left before she ended her show. She said, I'm going to devote one of them to Freedom Rides. I have to. And it was the 50th anniversary, so it was great. So she offered to fly in at her expense every living Freedom Rider, which would have been over 300 people and their families, to Chicago for this show. And it turned out 180 came. So they basically filled the Harpo studio there in Chicago. And this is great for my daughter. Finally, Dad was doing something really interesting. They could go to Oprah. Yeah, maybe a local hero, but anyway. The producers contact me and Stanley Nelson, the filmmaker, and they say, this is kind of a dark subject. People being threatened with death because they just want to sit in the front of a bus or sit down at a lunch counter. Have you got any reconciliation stories? Okay. Got any Reformed Klansmen we could bring on the show? And I said, well, yes, as a matter of fact, we do. And I pointed them to Elwyn Wilson, who was a 70-year-old ex-Klansman from Rock Hill, South Carolina. During the original Freedom Ride, there was no violence until they got to Rock Hill. And there was a small gang of Klansmen waiting at the bus station for them. And they came up and started beating some of the Freedom Riders up, particularly John Lewis. That's the first time you see him with the bandages on his head. It seems like half his life he had bandages on his head. And he was hurt pretty badly, but when the police came, he wouldn't press charges on Mr. Wilson or the other Klansmen. He said, it's the system that made him do this. I don't want to penalize any individual for this. It's not right. And so I'm sure the Klansmen were all kind of scratching their heads. Who is this guy, that we just beat up? Well, Mr. Wilson went on with his life. He left the Klan. He got married, had children, got religion, kind of got himself together, was a different person than the 23-year-old who was in that gang. He always felt guilty about what he'd done. I think particularly after Lewis became famous, and he knew he'd done this. And so fast forward to 2009, Barack Obama's first inauguration. Some of you may have been there in person, or maybe you saw it on TV. John Lewis was big as life, sitting right in the first row behind Barack Obama and the Chief Justice and the swearing in. So Mr. Wilson saw him, and on a kind of a whim, a couple days later, he calls John's office in Washington, not thinking he would get John, but John was this kind of hands-on guy. He did everything but sweep the floors you know, and no pretense, no sense of ego in the man. I just have always marveled at this. He answers the phone. And so Mr. Wilson is sobbing over the phone, apologizing, saying, "Can you ever forgive me? I don't know where my head was back in 1961. I'm so sorry that I did this to you." And so John starts crying. They're crying and praying together over the phone. And I think with most people that would have been the end of it, you know. But not with John Lewis. So he flies Mr. Wilson up to Washington for a kind of come to Jesus meeting in his office. And once again, they're praying and crying, and they become friends, you know. Quite remarkable. So when we needed this reconciliation story, we invited Mr. Wilson to come on. Now this is, excuse me. Okay, yeah. You have to get the scene here. There are probably 20 million people watching this show. Here's this one lone Klansman, ex-Klansman, kind of the designated villain. He's so nervous. He's surrounded by 180 freedom riders. And we try to tell him, no, these are the most forgiving people on earth. You don't have to worry. They're not going to attack you. They're not going to yell at you or anything. But he was just terrified. So the scene is, I'm sitting to John Lewis's right. I'm off camera, just off camera. So John's here, and then Mr. Wilson. So I have a ringside seat for what's going on. So Oprah asks Mr. Wilson the first question, and he just freezes. I mean, nothing comes out of his mouth. And Oprah sort of gulps, and so she tries another question. And it's even worse. Now he looks like for sure he's going to bolt from the stage. He's terrified. You can see in his eyes, just terrified. And it was just instinctive, I think, with John. He reaches out with his left hand, and he grabs Mr. Wilson's right hand, and in a voice you could hear all over the studio, he says, "He's my brother." You know, it was such an act of compassion and generosity to do that to this man who had, you know, beaten him insensible before. And so somehow Mr. Wilson got through it and said a few words, and he died 2 years later, but he had his day, you know. And I always thought that that's the quintessential John Lewis, that forgiveness, reconciliation, generosity. When he was elected to Congress in 1986, the New York Times ran a piece about the new congressmen and women, and it said, the only one who has a real problem is John Lewis. He has the saint problem, because everybody thinks he's a saint. And his friends started calling him St. John and that stuff. But I never met anyone like him, really. You know, I mean, just when I set out to write the book, I didn't want it to be hero worship. I didn't want it to be hagiography. I kept thinking, I'll find some flaws somewhere in this man. But, I mean, he was involved in a lot of controversies. In particular, he was not what you call a race man. He was more into human rights than civil rights. And he had this broad kind of progressive agenda, way ahead of other people. I mean, he was for same-sex marriage and LGBT rights and environmental concerns, anything you can imagine. It wasn't just civil rights. And on a number of occasions, he had to choose between a white candidate to support them that he respected, or a black candidate that he knew wasn't as good. And without fail, he supported the white candidate. And he took a lot of heat for it. In particular, when Clarence Thomas was up to the Supreme Court, and the Congressional Black Caucus supported him, because, hey, here's another black man, he'll replace Thurgood Marshall. John said, "Are you kidding me? That man's an insult." And he would not back down. And they lost a lot of support for a while. But I think ultimately people respected him because he always stood up for what he believed in. He really, I can't think of a time, and I've spent years and years researching his life and talking to people about him, that we were very lucky to have him. I don't think we'd ever have a better exponent of free speech, because he was not only a passionate man who really cared about what he believed in, he was a great listener. He always wanted to listen to other people's points of view. Now, he was stubborn, that wouldn't necessarily change his mind, but he always wanted everybody to get their say. And he just did everything he could to prevent the kind of intimidation which chills free speech. And this book meant a lot to me, and I miss him every day, really. Thank you.
See if I can learn how to use this thing. Eat the mic, right? We have time for questions, so we have a wonderful guest here. I'll run around and bring the mic.
This is not a question, but I want to thank you. This was the most inspiring speech that I've heard in a long time. Thank you very much.
You're very kind.
This is a basic question.
All right.
So, knowing how well you do John Lewis, how much do you think what he was fighting against in terms of the old model of the South, how much of that was the system above the people, and were the people ready for their message?
It's a great question. I'm not sure that people are often ready for the message they need to hear. There's always going to be a certain dialogue, a certain journey, a certain resistance. But I think that the white South had already proven that it could change. I mean, it's not the revolution in the human heart that the freedom riders were fighting for, but there's a lot of evidence that if you can change behavior through law, ultimately ideas begin to change, attitudes begin to change. And I think we've seen that. Although I have to say, the hysteria that accompanied Barack Obama's election and the racism that has reemerged and the whole Trump phenomenon shocked me. I wasn't really ready for it. I knew there'd be some. I've spent my whole life studying this and being involved in civil rights, and I really thought I knew kind of the pulse of the United States, but I mean, I should have known better. There are enough examples of, you experience certain advances, and they're not necessarily permanent. I mean, a lot of what John Lewis fought for has been rescinded. The Voting Rights Act is in shambles. The Shelby decision, which basically cut out the enforcement provisions of the Voting Rights Act, Trump never would have won this last election if they hadn't had the Shelby decision. I mean, no way he would have won. There's been so much voter intimidation, so much many Republicans are openly, denying the right to vote. Anything, the end justifies the means. And so we really only had a true political democracy from 1965 to about 2013. Now we're headed back towards the dark ages, you might say. I don't think it's permanent, but I mean, it just shows you how difficult it is, and how you can, freedom is a struggle. It's not a sprint; it's a marathon, and every generation has to refight these battles, I guess. And certainly, I think John has left an incredible legacy. I think of empowering people, but it'd be nice to have him himself in the flesh to serve as a real striking example.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are about DEI, and we don't have another John Lewis. Who do you think will step up to the plate? How can we step up to the plate?
Well, I think there are people who, of course, are defending the principles of DEI. I was in Selma in March each year they have a recreation of the Bloody Sunday, the Bloody Sunday where John was beaten after leading 600 marchers across Edmund Pettus Bridge. And it's called Faith in Politics. And he would try to get as many congressmen and women as he could to come for kind of 3 days of civil rights nostalgia, if you will. So I was the keynote speaker this last year, and I got to spend some time with Jim Clyburn. I was very impressed with him, I must say, and Steny Hoyer, and there were a lot of people there who I think are, determined to continue the fight. And so DeSantis won't be with us forever. I say that with my fingers crossed. I retired in January of 21 from teaching after 50 years. I was very active. I was president of the faculty senate and head of the ACLU, and always involved in politics, progressive politics, and no one ever said a word to me negative. The administrators always backed me up, never threatened me, never said anything. But now it's different. I mean, I know people who are really chilled. People are changing their soli. They're refusing to speak out. Not everybody, but in fact, my friends joke that if I had not retired when I did, I'd probably be in jail right now. And I don't think so, but it's particularly for the K through 12 teachers now. It's just a horror. And so we've never needed a DEI more than we need it now, really. And I mean, I've heard of some stories. You probably know about the New College situation. So the professor there, I won't name his name, I don't want to get him in trouble, but he had me down to speak about raising civil rights the other day to his class. He didn't make me put a bag over my head or anything, but he didn't. He was courageous. He really was. And but you have to look over your shoulder these days. It's really so sad. The whole notion of academic freedom and being able to speak your mind. I think there are lots of people willing to do it, but as people get pushed out, I know my daughter and son-in-law are both in the State Department and very high-profile positions, and it's a good chance they're going to lose their job in the next few weeks. And a lot of their colleagues, some of the best colleagues, are quitting. I mean, it's just. So what the State Department, for example, will look like after Trump gets through with it, I don't know. So I worry about the world that my 2 young grandchildren are inheriting because of what's happening. But I'm also cheered by how many people are willing to fight, the kind of resistance, are willing to stand up and incur risk to get into good trouble and not worry about what happens to them, but have a broader sense about the beloved community and about protecting other people's rights. So who knows what's going to happen? It's a nervous time, isn't it?
Over here, show us your book. Tell me the name of the book. Hold it up.
I feel like Vanna White. It's called John Lewis in Search of the Beloved Community.
Oh, all right, I love it.
The Yale University Press.
I want to buy one.
The paperback's coming out in about 2 weeks.
I like a hardback.
Of course, the hardback's better, but it's sold very, very well. I think 12,000 copies so far. Yes, sorry.
Okay, very good. I just wanted to go to the past again, I guess, but I was wondering, was there a time when you or maybe John Lewis's followers thought that he should have used violence instead of nonviolence?
It's like Jimmy Carter having lust in his heart. The Playboy interview in 1976. I think to live in this era,
I think we probably all said things we maybe shouldn't have said, thought ideas maybe that are at odds with maybe our best principles, and but hopefully most of the time we catch ourselves, you know, and certainly I don't think John was ever tempted about violence at all. He lost his being the chairperson of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee because of his commitment to nonviolence. He was replaced by Stokely Carmichael, who didn't believe in interracialism, didn't believe in nonviolence. And it was a really embittering thing for John. And here he is, 26 years old, no job, out on the street. He had to reinvent himself, and he did. I mean, amazingly, he later worked in the Carter administration, running projects for the elderly. He was on the Atlanta City Council for 5 years. He worked for the Voter Education Project. You know, he never stopped, and it was all nonviolent for sure. And he once said, and this is not original to him, but I often think about this. Dr. King said the same thing, and so did Jim Lawson. To be truly nonviolent, you have to love your enemies as much as you love your friends. Love your enemies as much as you love your friends. And what he meant by that, of course, is that you love them as human beings, that you don't give up on them, that you treat them as fully human. You don't dehumanize them. You don't have acts of violence against them. And it's a very hard thing to do, I think. But if you can somehow find that place in your heart to do it, I know many of the Freedom Riders. I spent a lot of time with them, and they're like no other people I've ever met, frankly. There's one who's still alive, Bernard Lafayette. He was John's roommate in college, and from Tampa. He's still probably the leading nonviolent trainer in the world at age 84. He's incredible. He was one of the major sources for my book. And Bernard, he talks about moral jujitsu. That's his phrase, moral jujitsu. And what he's saying is that if someone acts violently toward you, and you don't respond with violence, you respond with kindness or understanding, you throw them off balance in the way you would with jujitsu. They don't know how to deal with it, you know. I mean, you may get hurt in the process, but I think that's getting close to what it means to be able to love your enemies. That's how you get to the beloved community, you know. And I think John really did. That's how he treated Mr. Wilson, you know. Total forgiveness, you know, total generosity. Now, obviously, not all humans can do this. But a few years ago, I've done a lot of civil rights tours in the Deep South, and one of them, we had 192 students on 5 buses with 10 Freedom Riders, and we went with 4 college presidents from Nashville, and Jim Lawson, of course, John Lewis's teacher, was kind of leading the way, and I almost felt sorry for some of those kids because they thought they were just going on a joyride down to Montgomery, you know, getting a long weekend. And I saw this scene where Jim Lawson was in the face of this kid, poor kid. And I don't know what the first part of the conversation was, but Jim is looking right in the eye, right up to his face, and says, "What are you going to do to make the world a better place? What are you going to do? I want you to tell me." And the kid was sort of shaking. He said, "I don't know, I'm just on the bus." You know? And I think Jim knew he came on a little too strong with the poor kid, but a few minutes later, when he was answering a question to the whole group, 192 students, he said, "You know, we can't all be John Lewis. We can't all be Martin Luther King, but we can start with generosity." It's the term he used. Generosity in your life. Be as generous as you can in spirit and materially to other people. And that is such a start. It's kind of unraveling a lot of the negativity in the world. So. Oh, yeah.
think that's my phone. Just ignore it. Sorry.
Hi, I hope you have time for one other. A few years ago, I went on a pilgrimage with a group of people from Gainesville. Basically, it was a church pilgrimage to Montgomery, and we traveled for a weekend on a bus, me and Joy Avery, and we visited all these various spots. And I would like to suggest that anybody here take a group of young people, that would be high school and college students, to Montgomery and take that tour and give them some lessons about, you know, what happened in the past. It was a very eye-opening thing. And what we did in Selma is we walked across the
Pettus Bridge.
bridge. And we really learned a lot from that whole event.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I've led 13 of those trips, usually about 8 days long, sometimes with law students, graduate students, sometimes with teachers,
Wow.
and other people.
And when you kind of my friends used to say, you've ruined a lot of tax lawyers. You know, by the time they all wanted to be civil rights lawyers by the time they got home. But we always had freedom riders on the bus. And I sort of called in a lot of chips from people I know in the movement to talk to them. But just the museums themselves are spectacular, particularly the new Equal Justice Initiative, the Lynching Memorial, the new museum in Montgomery. I've been a consultant for most of those museums and helped create them. And it's just, you know, I always wanted to take my students there. Finally, I was able to do it with the law students, Stetson Law School, and they provided the funds, and we started doing it every year, and it was life-changing for me, I must say. I mean, I've been to all those places before, but it's always different, and after I did this so many times, I thought, well, it's not going to have any impact on me, right? I've done this before. Every time, I would tear up part of the trip, and you'd hear these incredible stories, and to see where history happened in places like Anniston and Birmingham, Montgomery, Selma, Tuskegee, Jackson, Mississippi. Really, it's life-changing. I really think so. I urge any of you who can do it. I'm going to be starting some tours next year, sponsored, I think, by Eckerd College, and so I'm going to start it up again if I have the emotional energy to do it.
Good.
Unfortunately, a lot of the people that I enlist are now gone. You know, every year it's different. We just, 2 days ago, I don't know if you read the New York Times.
Just invite young people.
Well, I think the intergenerational part is important. But I spoke to a group the other night in Sarasota of high school students from Booker High School, and 25 of them are going to go on that trip in March. And I was just so impressed with these kids. You know, they were just so excited. And they came up to me after when I was signing their book, treating me like a historical artifact. One kid said, I've never been with history before. I'm feeling older every minute, I know. She meant it as a compliment, I guess. But there's no substitute for that. And you don't need an organized trip. You can just get in your car and go to Montgomery and Birmingham. Some of the best museums in the country are there. The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Rose Parks Museum, all the EJI museums, and amazingly, I never thought I could say this, but all these museums have created a kind of a civil rights tourism industry, and it's now bigger than Civil War tourism. I think that's the most encouraging thing I've ever. I know, I never thought I'd live to see it, but it's true.
Jay, I just have one quick question.
I remember reading one time, and I was really surprised that John Lewis said that the place where he was the most frightened was St. Augustine, even more than the bridge. Have you ever heard anything about that?
Well, what he said, I think, he wasn't in St. Augustine, but a lot of his friends were.
Martin Luther King was that.
St. Augustine in 1964. That was one of the scariest moments for the movement in general. Haas Manussi, who was the sheriff, deputized the Ku Klux Klan as deputy sheriffs. So talk about the fox trolling the hen house. And Dr. King was staying in a beach house. He wasn't there, and they riddled hundreds of bullets. He would have been killed if he were there, just completely. The local movement people would have marches through the black community every night, and it was just a powder keg, really, just awful. I had a good friend who was there. His father was one of King's aides, and he had been in California, and he got there late, and he read about what was going on, and his girlfriend was in jail. So he tries to see her if she's okay. And he comes out to the parking lot, and suddenly he's surrounded by Klansmen. And they were really threatening, and one of the Klansmen says, "You're nothing but a N-word loving communist." And now this friend of mine, his family's lived in South Carolina for 200 years. And he says, and the guy was calling him an outside agitator. He said, "I resent that," And he starts babbling away about his family heritage. And there was and he told them, "I'm a democratic socialist." And I'm not sure that helped. But then the local leader of the Klan, who was in this parking lot scene, said, "Okay, I've heard of that, but I don't believe in that. I'm a Hinduist," he said. "I'm a Hinduist." And somehow they parted shaking hands. They let him go, and then the next day, the Klan was marching through the black community, and he sees the Hinduist guy, who just waves. So sometimes there are these moments where you can break through, just on a human level. Maybe that's the best hope we have.
I think we should all thank Ray for a wonderful presentation. He actually certainly brought the spirit of John Lewis here to us in our gathering. I also want to do our ritual presenting of the Free Speech Cup.
Oh, great.
Not that you need it.
No, I love these.
We tried to get the good
I have a whole cabinet full of these.
Okay.
I love it. Thank you so much. That's great.
Before we break this up today, I want to remind people about Paul Hargrave. He has been an integral part of our organization for decades and has provided us with speakers and contacts which we've all benefited from. And if you want to sign a card to him or some remembrance or something like that, he is gravely ill, and we just have to somehow express our thanks to him. A few other nuts and bolts things. We've had some registration issues. People have been trying to use their phones to register for the forum. That doesn't work. You need to do it online on your computer and stuff. Also, please register 1 week ahead so we can give ample notice to the Culinary Institute here so they can continue to provide us with lovely meals and lovely hospitality. And the last thing I want to say is that there's a board meeting here right following this lecture. Okay, thanks for coming.